I'm a little bit, a little bit of a control freak.
This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. I want to play something for you. You're hearing Starvation Army by Oldest, featuring my guest, Brooks Headley on drums. Brooks grew up in Baltimore and in 1992 began playing with local hardcore band Universal Order of Armageddon. Over the subsequent 25 years, his body of work has expanded to include recordings with the bands Born Against, Young Pioneers, Skull Control, and Wrangler Brutes. In addition to his work as a drummer, Brooks has built a formidable career in the restaurant business. His work as a pastry chef at Del Posto won him an award from the James Beard Foundation. Currently, he's the proprietor of Superiority Burger, a vegan restaurant that in short order has become an international sensation. As a drummer, he stays active with Oldest, his band with guitar wizard Mick Barr. I spoke to Brooks near his restaurant on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And now my conversation with Brooks Headley.
I live with my mom, and she was a school teacher, elementary school teacher. That's what she did pretty much her whole life. So,
is she still around?
No, she's not around anymore. But she was incredibly supportive, always, about any sort of ridiculous music thing I ever did. So,
was she pretty passionate about teaching?
Oh, for sure. She was like a psychopath in like the coolest way, you know.
What do you mean? Like, give me an example of how she was a psychopath.
I mean, you know, she just cared so much. And she would just talk about the kids in her class, and like, she was really concerned. I mean, this is late 70s, early 80s when my memory starts kicking in of her being a elementary school teacher and her talking about things like making sure that, you know, there was like a multicultural approach to the way she was teaching and things like that, which, you know, nowadays is pretty commonplace. But I think then, specifically like in the suburbs of Baltimore, which wasn't the most progressive place in the world, you know, she probably worked with other teachers that were like kind of stuck in the 50s, that had maybe been teaching since the 50s. So she was kind of like, she just was always kind of trying to do the right thing, you know, and it was just something that was like really fun to watch. I remember that even as a kid, you know, even if I didn't totally understand what was going on. So,
do you ever hear her voice in your head when you're trying to make a decision?
Yeah, of course. Like, in the sense of like, you know, she was the kind of person who, you know, if it was a family gathering or dinner, she would do all the cooking and have everything set up. And then she would take one sip of white wine and go like, whoop, well, I'm drunk. You know, and that would be the only sip of alcohol she would have taken since the last dinner a year prior to that, you know. So in terms of just having your...
So she was straight edge?
Pretty much, yeah. She was definitely straight edge, you know. Although the sip of wine maybe negated it, but whatever, it's fine. But yeah, in terms of kind of having your act together, she always had her act together. So like whether it's cooking or music or whatever, that's I definitely hear her. So. And
your dad wasn't around?
Not really, no.
When did music become part of your world?
I think initially it started, I would, I want to say like Dr. Demento, which I would listen to on the radio, but only if I was staying or in Pittsburgh at my grandmother's house.
Because it wasn't syndicated in Baltimore?
It wasn't syndicated in Baltimore, so... And I think it played on Sundays, and I was just really into like novelty music, stuff like that.
Like Barnes and Barnes, Fish Heads.
Oh
and
my
stuff?
God, yeah, Barnes and Barnes, amazing. Like They're Coming to Take Me Away, all that stuff. Like, I just thought it was I was obsessed with it. Like the first 2 cassettes that I ever owned were Steve Martin, Wild and Crazy Guy, and the Bee Gees version of the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack, which only because it had Steve Martin doing Maxwell's Silver Hammer on that cassette. So just like sort of very like Wild and Crazy Guy is like such juvenile humor that even like an 8-year-old can understand it, even if you don't necessarily understand the jokes. Like Steve Martin's delivery like made it funny. So yeah, knowing that if I was at my grandmother's house on a Sunday and at like 9 p.m. the Dr. Demento show would play, I remember like getting the radio and like going into like a back bedroom so no one would bother me, and just to hear these like weird, strange, like maybe not even that funny in retrospect kind of songs. So,
was your grandma a musical person?
She had a ton of records, and one of those old crazy,
like a console thing.
Yeah. Like a ton of records. I really specifically remember her having like 4 copies of Herb Alpert Whipped Cream and Other Delights, that had, people had like drawn names and like, blacked out teeth and eyeballs on it,
Who had done that?
I guess
Your
other maybe not her. She was pretty straightforward too. But yeah, like I just remember like flipping through the records and like I was always obsessed with food, so like that record was like, whoa, there's like whipped cream on the cover, so that's cool. Like maybe I'll listen to this,
So were you obsessed with food before you were into music?
I've always been obsessed with food. To the point that when I was a kid, I loved going to the grocery store so much and I made kind of like a sort of a blood sport out of it, that my mom would have to go without me or like do it in times when I couldn't go because I would just fill the cart with stuff, or like even being at the cash register with all the end cap with all the candy and magazines and stuff, I would just, I would kind of lose it. But yeah, so just any idea of food always had been like pretty like fresh in my head as like a cool thing, so.
And you have no idea where that came from?
I mean, my mom and grandmother they were great cooks, and they did cook a lot, but it wasn't the most important thing. It was just it was functional, but it was also like there was definitely care put into it to a point that I understood and could see that this was, something that was not just to get food on the table. This was a sort of like, there was passion and enthusiasm with it. So, I don't, you know what? Honestly, I don't think I ever found anything that was like a weird record she had from, the mid '60s that like excited me or whatever, anything like that. So, but it was more like I said, I could listen to the Dr. Demento show there, and then back at home, I would just listen to the radio. And I really liked making mixtapes from the radio,
yes.
which a lot of, kids of that era would do,
Yes.
So just record like a huge block of time, and then with a double cassette
that'll
recorder.
Be your source, and then you whittle it down.
Yeah, get the good songs,
Would you ever call in and request stuff?
Yeah, but I was a shy, really nervous kid, so
yeah.
That was like, even if I was going to do that on, a bigger radio station, like, that was almost the end of the world in terms of anxiety. But then once I discovered the college radio station at Towson State University, then it was a little more kind of doable, because I knew that if I called, someone was going to pick up the phone, and I could say, and I knew the specific DJs had different genres that they would play. So I could, almost in a weird way to please them, I would say like, oh, this is the industrial guy, so I'm gonna call in and request some Savage Republic because he played some a couple weeks ago, and then he'll be like, oh, excellent choice, dude. Just in a way.
You're seeking approval
yes,
from
I was
this
seeking
guy
approval.
that you don't even know.
Right, who was probably 3 years older than me, but at the time
Seemed
could
like
have been
he was
100.
30 years older than you.
Exactly.
Yes. Same thing with the record store clerk.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Well, when did you start playing?
I started playing drums in 4th grade. I guess you're 9 or 10 now?
Yeah, you turn 10 in 4th grade usually.
So we had kind of like opening band class, and then the band teacher passed out permission slips, and everyone said, or the teacher looked at everyone and said, if you want to play flute, get your parents to approve of this, or trombone, or trumpet, or whatever. And I knew I had to play drums. It was just, it wasn't even like I really made the choice. And I really specifically remember like going home that day and being like really nervous, like because I think there were only 5 slots for drummers because we're all just gonna play stand-up snare drum. Remember getting home and like giving my mom the slip and going like, I'm gonna play drums, like, and they're like watching her, like, you're gonna fill it out, right? You're gonna fill it out. No, I'm watching you. You're gonna fill it out, right? And then being the first person in line the next day, which there was no line because
you were the only person.
I was the only person in line for any of the instruments, but I really I was committed. I had to be one of the drummers, and then it's. I specifically also remember that I had the drum case was this kind of round plastic case with padding.
Yes. Like a Ludwig molded plastic
student
snare drum case.
And we couldn't afford to get me a new one, so I got a refurbished used one, which at the time I was sort of bummed out about because you're a kid, you don't want someone else's stuff.
And it's before new. Vintage was cool.
Oh yeah, there's nothing cool about it.
It was just used.
Yeah, it was a used snare drum, but we were 10-year-olds. Nobody knew how to tune a drum or get the snares on right or anything like that. So mine sounded better than everyone's because whoever had it before had it set up well, which I think irked the other 4 drummer kids. But so then that kind of soothed my angst a little. So I was like, well, mine sounds better even though it's weird. So.
Well, why was it so important to you before you even started playing? Like, why did it feel like the drums were calling to you?
I'm not really sure. And even to this day, I go through, I'm not the kind of person that plays drums all the time. I go through throughout my life, I've gone through pretty intense dry spells of years without playing drums, and then I'll get back into it. But it's always, it's like the rhythm, I'm always tapping. I guess I always was before, but initially I don't know. It was something that I didn't specifically have personal control over. It was weirdly decided for me. I don't know. I know that sounds a little kooky new age, but
Do you think you have personal control over anything, really? Or are we just a product of our genetics and our environment?
Yeah,
of which we have
maybe
control
especially these days, So
did you get fully into drums right away in 4th grade? Did you start picturing yourself playing in a band or having fantasies involving drumming in any way?
I think I was just really into it, and in band class we just stood the long stand and played but I immediately loved it, and when it kind of developed into later band classes in middle school where you've got cymbals and you've got timpani and bass drum. Timpani was any sort of tuning and other instrumentation other than hitting things always scared me. Still kind of scares me. Timpani, if you have to tune it to sound a different way, I would be maybe that's not for me. Maybe I'll just do the cymbal, So, but it was initially and then entirely, pretty much up until this day, is hitting things is hugely part of like who I am. So
What do you hit when you're going through your dry spells?
my thighs, like I spend a good hour and a half at the end of service every night at the restaurant, like writing out prep lists, and I think I spend most of that time like banging on the table, like, and it's involuntary. I've had old bosses and girlfriends and coworkers that they'll really pick up on it and be like, "You're just tapping constantly. You're always tapping," and then other people like might not notice it, and then I don't necessarily even notice it. Maybe I'll notice it if I'm really getting into it, and like my thighs start to get like they hurt, like maybe hurt a little bit,
oops.
So, but it's always there's always this like a glimmer in the back of my head where it's like, oh, when am I going to actually sit behind a kit again, so.
When did you start your first band?
I think I was 16, maybe 15 or 16. And we were pretty terrible. But we practiced. I was the drummer, so we practiced in my house. We were called the Fifth Column, which we thought was incredibly subversive and edgy, and had no idea that there were like 5 other bands called Fifth Column, Mm-hmm. And we...
So you already were interested in being subversive at that age?
Yeah, because at least at that particular time, I had gotten into punk rock, but then it was a really brief thing where it was like Dead Kennedys, Minor Threat, Circle Jerks, and then as a 16-year-old, I decided I had grown out of that immediately. And then because of the college radio station that I liked, there was a DJ who played weird, cool industrial music for his 2-hour slot on Sunday nights. So then I was like, this stuff is weird. This is what I'm into now. So I got rid of all my punk records and started buying, Throbbing Gristle.
Yeah. As one does.
Yes. Eventually got out of that and rebought all the punk records again. But so for that particular time, the band, we all really, Joy Division too. Like,
sure.
We really wanted to be this weird subversive band. And I've thought about it a lot in retrospect, and we were from the suburbs, like we didn't live in a city. We were so isolated in this world where everything was kind of glossed over and perfect, but there was underlying, like, things were screwy, so I don't know if kids that grow up like that occasionally like go towards that direction,
It seems like it. I mean, it seems like that's where most of the hardcore bands originate from, and even people like Genesis from Throbbing Gristle probably grew up in like bleak countryside of England type thing.
Sure,
suburban England.
Exactly. But yeah, we really wanted to, and I think listening to Joy Division drums, like those were the first kind of.
And also, Manchester's like the Baltimore of England.
There
if
you
you
go.
think about it, right?
Sure, yeah. But like those, like trying to teach myself those drum beats, like the song "Heart and Soul" from Closer, where it's like, which isn't like a particularly complex beat, but
the rhythmic precision.
Yeah. So like trying to like, can I play this? Can I play this? And then all of us being into that music, like this is what we wanted to sound like. Of course, we weren't anywhere near good enough players to pull that off, so we ended up just sounding like a crummy local band.
Is that what you thought at the time, or were you not conscious that you were crummy?
I think I was a little bit conscious,
but you were into it.
Yeah, of course. It was it was fun, and like we practiced in my basement, completely non-soundproofed in any way. Incredibly loud, like for the whole. You could hear it 3-4 houses away, which is funny now going to like a rehearsal space in Midtown Manhattan where you can't even hear the room next door sometimes, knowing that like we were like.
I think that means your innocence is officially gone.
Oh, well, it happens. What are you going to do?
So when you were playing in this band when you were 16, did you have any ambitions of becoming a professional musician?
I think I had an idea in my head of what going on tour was like. Even though this would have been 4 years before I ever would actually go on the first tour that I would go on. And that it was this kind of romantic thing where you wake up in another city and you go and you get to play a show every single day and you get to meet all these people in different parts of the country. But I didn't think of it in terms of like becoming famous or rich through playing music. Like in my fantasies of what I thought it was going to be like, it was kind of almost like what it was when I did do that, which is actually just traveling and playing a show and nobody really caring too much and never making that much money, just enough to get you to the next place.
Yeah.
So I had a weird sort of pragmatic fantasy of what would become what it was, so.
Where does that sense of pragmatism come from?
Probably from my mom, because she was just very pragmatic in terms of like just life in general. So. And
I feel like lots of the punk rock that was happening at the time was aligned with that same sense of pragmatism.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, even to this day, I can think about Fugazi.
Yeah.
And, be like, okay, well, that's the right way you're supposed to live,
Yeah, I think of that a lot too. I think they were kind of like my gold standard. That would have been my fantasy, like, which is not even as pragmatic as what you're describing, because they would play to like 2,000 people or something.
Yeah.
When did you start touring? When you were 20?
Yeah, I was 20. I had, I was 20.
Which was the first band that you toured with?
Born Against. Mm-hmm. I had joined Born Against in 1992. I still lived in Baltimore, and Tony Joy, who I was playing with in Universal Order of Armageddon, it was this weird sort of package deal where he became the new bass player for Born Against, and I became the new drummer. So half of the band was brand new, with these two weirdos from Baltimore and Annapolis, Maryland, and we would basically drive every Sunday morning. I would pick up Tony, and we would drive all the way up here. And Sam and Adam from Born Against lived in Jersey City at the time, so we would drive 4 hours from Baltimore to Jersey City, and then we would practice at a pay-by-the-hour rehearsal space in Jersey City, and we would practice for 4 hours, go back to their house, make some sort of like nutritional yeast, tahini, roasted garlic spaghetti, eat it, and then immediately drive back to Baltimore. I would drop Tony off, and then I would go back to my job, And
what was your job?
I was a house painter.
And were you going to school or anything at the time?
I was in school and then basically quit to join Born Against, which obviously did not make my mom very happy, being
an educator.
Yes. So her son is quitting. He's in college and he's quitting to go join a band that's not even in the same city, that definitely doesn't make any money. But at the same time, she was also she didn't freak out, and for then the next 10 years she did ask me every time I talked to her when I was going to go back to school, but in kind of like a gentle way until I actually did. But definitely I definitely didn't please her too much anyway. And it's funny because on the second Born Against 7-inch EP, the Matrix Scribe says, what does it say? It says, quit school, join the band. So I remember seeing that after I did that, and I was like, oh, that's what I did, And then I remember talking to those guys later, and they're like, oh, that was a typo. It was supposed to say quit school, join a band. So I don't know. It's just kind of a funny aside on that. So
that was the universe.
Yes, there you go. So.
I guess we don't have any control.
None, zero.
We figured it out. So when you were making the nutritional yeast tahini spaghetti, were you the one that was masterminding the recipe?
For that one, no. That would have been Adam, the guitar player from Born Against, because number one, we were at his house, and that was kind of his thing.
So was it kind of like a vegan Alfredo situation?
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny because we actually have at Superiority Burger now, we have a potato salad that, uses these insane potatoes that we get from the market from this one farmer who's amazing and grows them in just the right amount of perfectly mineraled soil, and then we make this vegan sauce for it that is basically the same thing, the nutritional yeast tahini thing, which is funny every time we make it because, maybe not that much has changed. So
when you decided to go back to school, what was the impetus for doing so?
I had moved to Richmond, Virginia, and then I was in another band, Young Pioneers, with Adam from Born Against. And we did a lot. We put out tons of records, recorded all the time, would tour as much as we could. And then I think I got to a certain point where I just decided, I guess I want to go back to school. And then I think that day that my mom called me, because I would talk to her like once a week or something, and I would pick up the phone and she would say, "Hey, so when are you going back to school?" And this time I was like...
That was her greeting?
Yeah. And I think this time I was like, oh, I already applied. And I don't think she didn't also very calm, didn't freak out. She was like, oh, that's great.
To the University of Virginia?
No, I had moved, I moved to DC. So
okay.
but my plan was to move up from Richmond back not fully to Baltimore, but to DC. And to go to University of Maryland, which is where I ended up finishing.
Terps.
Yeah, exactly. Where I basically needed to finish 2 years, which I did, and was super nerd, like.
You were focused.
I was totally focused,
And what did you study?
My degree is in writing and rhetoric, so it was just read a lot of books and. Wrote a lot of papers, and it was actually kind of fun. And it was so different from the previous 5 or 6 years of being in a band and going on tour that like I was like, okay, well, I'm done with that for now. I'm gonna do this. So.
Mm-hmm. What made you feel like you were done with it?
I've always kind of gone through these. I've never been in a band that ever toured Europe or like got to that sort of next level of you're actually doing something other than like putting out a 7-inch a record and touring the US. So that's all I've really known from like being in bands. So it would always kind of get to a point where I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess, we've done what we could, maybe it's not, maybe this last record wasn't as exciting as the first record that I played on or whatever. So maybe it's time to like try something different, Mm-hmm. I weirdly feel kind of blessed in a way that I've never been in a band that had to do the thing where you get to the venue really early in sound check and then you just kind of are in limbo until much later when you play the show. Like, I don't even know what that's like because I've never been in a band like that.
I hate doing that. I would always try to not do sound check. Like as the drummer, I was like, let's just show up 5 minutes before.
Sure, yeah.
Put our things on, and everybody would get so mad at me.
Right. Well, especially, you're the drummer. Like you have the most stuff to set up,
Yeah.
So I always, especially with Universal Order of Armageddon, like a lot of times we would get to the show 10 minutes before we were supposed to play, unload, play, and then pack up, and then the rest of the day, whether that was a long drive or maybe we found a flea market or a thrift store in South Dakota to go hang out at instead of getting there early enough to like have it be organized, so that, I mean, even to this day, like, if I think about that, like, that kind of touring is, like, probably one of my favorite things ever. So,
were you exposed to any mind-blowing cuisine when you were on tour?
Not so much, because at the time we were all vegetarian. Like,
and you were eating lots of like spaghetti with nutritional yeast at people's houses.
I mean, that was that occasionally that was that, but also it was more just trying to find, I mean, whatever was the regional place that all the punk kids went to, whether that's like Fake Burger in San Diego, or there's what was the I mean, California was
a mecca.
Yeah, it was total mecca. Like, just getting into Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, you could sense the anticipation. Like, everyone's like per diems are just like kind of like glowing in their pockets, just waiting to like get whatever vegetarian stuff is around. But yeah, so it wasn't necessarily. I mean, we would cook occasionally on tour too. There's a lot of people that I try to explain that to now don't believe it. It was like, yeah, we would get to someone's house. It wasn't that late because the show was early. None of us drank. Like, no one was partying, and we would like make Nature's Burgers or like fry some potatoes and then eat it, go to sleep. So.
Yeah, that's an incredibly kind of comforting thing to do when you're on the road.
Sure, yeah. Like, if you can figure, if the place you're staying has equipped enough a kitchen to like do something like that, yeah, it's pretty awesome. So,
did you ever think about opening a restaurant back then?
I think I did, and I think honestly, what I would have wanted is what I actually have now, but I didn't have any framework to conceptualize that because I'd never worked in a restaurant. I didn't know anything about cooking professionally in terms of like cooking on large scale. So maybe in the back of my head, I was like, wouldn't it be cool to have a vegetarian restaurant where you just cook awesome vegetarian food and then and then people in bands get to come and eat at your restaurant?
Yeah,
which is sort of what Superiority Burger is, more or less. So
fantasy fulfilled.
I guess so, in one way or another. So,
well, what was your path to that? You went back and got a degree in writing and rhetoric.
Yeah, and then I did another band, Skull Control, in DC. That was fun because it was.
I remember that band.
The band was completely ridiculous. Like, there was no intention to do anything other than just like play songs. Like, other bands I'd been in had some sort of like social or political justice bent. This one had zero. And it was like I was 26, 27 years old, so I had like kind of amassed new music that I liked to like, I'd always like early on, like the way I was playing drums was maybe just influenced by whatever I knew, whereas like later on it's like I knew about more stuff. So I was like, oh, well, I can rip off this Slits drum beat. And like that was like, that's cool. Like, I would never have done that before, stuff like that. And then
shout out to Budgie.
Yeah,
if you're listening, buddy.
Yeah. There you go.
There you go.
The thing that I basically had I had a college degree, and then I had another band, and then that band broke up, Skull Control, and then I was sort of living in DC with a writing and rhetoric degree. Wasn't in a band, so I was sort of like...
So your options are, go back to grad school, become a lawyer or something, become a teacher, become a professor.
Right, like what was I going to do,
Or go into the restaurant business.
Right, well, I had, right after all that happened, I had I had an office job for 2 weeks that I hated, because, I've got an English degree, I'm 27 years old and living in DC. There you go. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, I found out, I found this ad in the DC City paper that just said pastry assistant wanted. with no information, a fax number. My girlfriend at the time was sick of me complaining about the office job. I was like, you're not in a band, and I, I loved cooking. Like, I cooked for fun. That was my hobby at that point. So she's like, I think she had on her, like, old Apple computer, like the box thing, she had, like, maybe written half the letter that I was going to fax or something like that. My memory's a little bit hazy on that, but basically it was like, just apply for this job. And I, almost to spite her, I was like, okay, fine, I will. Because I had it just said pastry assistant wanted and had a fax number. That was it.
So first your mom convinced you to go back to school, and then your girlfriend convinced you to apply for that job.
Yeah, I guess you
like to surround yourself with strong, willful women.
There you go. Probably. And it turned out that particular restaurant that faxed letter was going to was, this restaurant called Galileo, which at the time was the best Italian restaurant in Washington, D.C., which I had no business even walking in the door to eat or to work. Walked in, and I think because I had just gotten an office job, I wore a suit to the interview, and I had my resume printed out in a manila envelope, which in retrospect is hilarious to think about now, because, like, that's not how you get a kitchen job. You just... at all, I don't know if anyone gets any job like that. I don't know, but ended up getting the job and immediately fell in love with everything about the professional kitchen. And because I was vegetarian, it was dessert, which involved no meat cookery of anything. So it kind of it fell in line with my dietary restrictions. So it was also fun to think about, too, because we were taking ingredients and making things that didn't exist. Like, if you make eclairs or pâte à choux, you take flour and butter and eggs and milk and make a thing that didn't exist beforehand. Whereas, like, if you're cooking a steak, like, you have the raw steak and then you have the cooked steak. You're denaturing the proteins, or heating it, you're adding... but in the end, it's the same. Whereas, like, in this dessert world that I was thrust into, like, in order to get ice cream, you have to make this thing that doesn't exist and then run it through a machine that creates this thing that is nothing like the thing that came first. So, in my mind, it was sort of like writing music, because 4 people sitting in a practice space, like, pushing parts together to end up with a thing that you eventually record and comes out on a 7-inch. There were a lot of similarities there, but like I said, it was because it just happened to be dessert, and I didn't even particularly like dessert or know anything about dessert. It just kind of worked out that way, because that was the job that they were willing to hire someone with no experience, because they needed hands, So, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So,
did you end up eating a lot of dessert?
Oh, for sure. I mean, when you work in a restaurant making dessert, you eat tons of dessert. That's just the nature of it, I specifically remember, and I was telling someone this story yesterday, that one of the things that really, like, was one of the things that happened at my first restaurant job was that someone was making vanilla ice cream, and it was being extruded out of the machine, and one of the other cooks walked by the machine and took her finger and kind of swiped into the ice cream that was going into the container, and, like, put it in her mouth. And I looked at her and I was like, whoa, can I do that? And she's like, yeah, go ahead. So I did it too. And it was like, vanilla ice cream freshly extruded from a machine. That's like when it's at its peak. Like, once it gets put in a container and put in a freezer, like, it immediately starts atrophying. And, like, no one ever, unless you work in a restaurant making dessert, gets to eat vanilla ice cream straight out of the machine. Like, it's not like soft serve.
It's like a band before it gets signed.
Yeah, it's so pure and it's so perfect and it's totally unstable and you can't scoop it. Like, you literally, all you can do is run your finger through it and put it in your mouth, So
What would a typical staff meal be at that restaurant?
Oh, well, that's funny because I was vegetarian still. Staff. It was an Italian restaurant, so staff meal was always pasta. Be like rigatoni with tomato sauce, or rigatoni with some strange meat and tomato sauce, or mussels. Like I had been vegetarian for a long time, and my mom never ate a lot of seafood or cooked it at the house, so I'd never eaten a lot of seafood. Like I'd never had mussels. So my first introduction to mussels was staff meal, where the mussels were in staff meal, meaning they were not good enough to sell to the public, so they weren't the greatest mussels. So I was like, wow, this pasta tastes strange with these shellfish inside of it, you know. Later on, learning that mussels aren't supposed to taste like that, that was like, you know, that was a cook cleaning out the walk-in. This is what you cook for family meal. And I think there would always be some sort of salad too, like mixed greens with like a very cursory dressing or whatever. But that was, you know, it was just like, staff meal was like sometimes you would spend 3 minutes eating staff meal. You know, you would put it on a plate, eat it as you were walking to the dish pit, and then put your dishes in and go straight back to work. You know, I mean, I don't expect that of people that work at my restaurant now. Like, you know, you eat, you sit down, you know, you take a break, you know, but in the late 90s, you know, that's kind of how restaurants were. You know, you just kept working. And that didn't bother me. Like, I was learning all these new things, so I just kind of wanted to get back to work. So, and, you know, if it had a plate of rigatoni with bad mussels, I could only take a couple bites anyway, so, you know.
Were you still not drinking or doing drugs at the time?
I think I'd started drinking at that point. Yeah, for sure. But,
did you smoke cigarettes?
I went off and on.
That's
a bunch. So.
I mean, I think of that as a very restaurant thing for me, because when I worked at restaurants,
it's funny too, because it destroys your palate. So it's like
it's counter to the mission, but on the other hand,
totally counter. So
there's something great about getting off your shift and having a cigarette.
Well, it was funny. Eventually, because I worked in the pastry kitchen, if say like a veal chop got messed up, or it was overcooked, or too many were fired, they would just send it back to the pastry kitchen, because the meat guys wanted sweets, and the people making the sweets wanted steak.
So did you become a Freegan?
I became, Freegan is not specifically Freegan, but I became a person that would eat things that I thought looked like they could be vegetarian, even if they weren't. So if a
like soup or something without meat chunks.
If a veal chop with a bone came back, I would be like, no, I'm vegetarian. I will not eat that. But if like linguine bolognese came back, I would look at it and be like, well, you know, it might be tofu. Then I would eat that. You know, clearly not vegetarian, but that was sort of so things that didn't have bones or were particularly like mammal-like. Yeah. That was kind of my gateway into not being vegetarian anymore from being in a restaurant. So
I was vegetarian and or vegan for about 20 years, and then I started eating meat when I moved to California, actually.
That's funny.
Yeah, it is funny, because I grew up in Milwaukee, which was a tricky place to be vegetarian back then.
I can only imagine, yeah.
But that's actually how I got pretty good at cooking, because my mom said, sure, you can be vegan, I'll buy your groceries, and then you're in charge of cooking anything that you want to eat.
That's cool.
So for me, when I started eating meat again, it kind of came from a place of nihilism, where I was just like, well, the world's fucked. I give up. I tried.
You know, I hear that more often than not from people that used to be vegetarian that eat meat, because we have a lot of regulars at the restaurant that aren't vegetarian but that used to be. Yeah. So that's not that uncommon of a story, the nihilism.
I don't think it's right, you know, because I don't think that there's any logical rationalization for doing it. Like if you believe that animals are sentient beings that deserve not to be eaten, and if you think that the planet is worth trying to preserve.
Right.
But I'm just a selfish asshole. I'm thinking about going back to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, the reason that I operate a vegetarian, mostly vegan restaurant.
Yeah.
In 2019 in New York City is that I'm totally conflicted about eating meat. Like, I'm not vegetarian anymore, but I'm sort of grossed out when I do eat meat. And even like I said, I wouldn't eat a thing with a bone.
Yeah.
20 years ago, like, I'm still a little squeamish about that, which if I eat like something that isn't like that, then I sort of feel guilty, and then maybe I'll fully be vegetarian for like a month, until something else kind of comes up. It's not like I'm
refreshing your karma.
Yeah. It's like, yeah. So I also, I'm not like a lot of people that are vegan specifically. That's part of their identity, you know, and that's totally cool. It's just I'm not a person that wants what I eat to define like me as a person or whatever. So I also think that at the restaurant, I think we make much more interesting, delicious vegetarian food because there's a core bunch of us that work at the restaurant that have tried other things that aren't vegetarian. You know, so, not that we're in any way selling that. So.
Walk me through how you moved from DC to New York and started working here.
Once I started working in restaurants, and the first one was a big fancy restaurant, I really enjoyed. I just got into it, and I became obsessed with it, like the minutia of fancy restaurant stats. The same way, like when I was a kid, I liked baseball cards, and I was into the stats of that. And then
what do you mean by stats? Like how many covers we do in a night?
Yeah, like all of how many covers, like
what our cost is, like
sure,
all
like
that stuff.
Yeah, like and who's like this person is doing this cool thing in New York City or Los Angeles that I know nothing about. Like they're baking bread in a certain way, or they're gelling chocolate in a certain way where you can twist it into a tube or whatever, you know. So like things like that became incredibly interesting to me, to the point that I stopped paying attention to music completely for like maybe a couple of years.
Yeah, and that was also at a time when the general consciousness in America was shifting towards food in a certain way.
Yeah.
I mean, through television especially, and through food writers like Jonathan Gold. But people were thinking about food more, and they were more willing to try things.
Exactly.
So it paved the way for adventurous chefs to be able to put their stuff out there and actually build an audience.
Sure. It was because when I first started getting into it, it was kind of the early stages of that.
Yeah.
So I had my friends that were in bands, and then I had my friends that worked in restaurants, and like they were such different groups that like they never meshed, you know. Whereas nowadays it's completely meshed, you know.
It's post Bourdain world.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I started cooking the year that
his book came
Kitchen
out.
Confidential came out, you know. So, but just the like learn, like even because you know it's kind of like it's 1999 2000. The internet isn't part of your life in the way it is now.
Right. So,
you know, going on like message boards and like chat rooms about food and like learning about things that are happening in other parts of the country that I would never go to because I had no means to. It's not like I was in a band and I was like, oh, I'm gonna go to Milwaukee because this woman in Milwaukee is doing this crazy thing with like spelt flour. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like that. It was like finding out these little glimmers of things and then being like, oh, well, what are they doing? Like, and then going back to work at whatever restaurant you're working in and saying like, how can I incorporate this idea that I don't even totally understand, But I bounced around a bunch.
It's the same concept as like when you're listening to a record pre-YouTube and you're trying to figure out what the drummer is doing. You don't completely understand it, but then you figure out the essential part and put it into another beat.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Where you can't see it. You didn't see the band live. You're not seeing any like hand motions or anything.
So you create your own version of it.
Sure. Yeah. It's fun. It's a pretty fun exercise, But yeah, bounced around, moved out to LA for a couple of years I moved out to LA to basically work at a very specific restaurant.
Which restaurant?
It was called Campanile. It was Nancy Silverton and Mark Peel ran it. I was obsessed with Nancy Silverton. Like her bread baking and her like pastry and ice cream work. Like I knew all of her books, so I figured out a way to get a job there. I lived there for 2 years. The first year I couldn't, and then the last year I lived there, I was able to work there. So, also I was in a band at the time. Like I had kind of spent a few years working in DC and like built it up to the point that I had a job as a pastry chef at a fancy restaurant. I was in charge of the menu. Way too soon for me to do that because I didn't totally understand things. But technically speaking, I kind of finally, at like almost 30 years old, had a career.
Yeah.
And then decided to quit that job, move to LA, start a new band. That was this band Wrangler Brutes, which is intentionally supposed to be as stupid as possible in everything that we did. With zero intention of ever making any money. Really, honestly, like losing as much money as possible, just doing it because like I liked being around the other three people in the band,
Yeah.
But then also because of the pragmatic person in my head, it was like, well, I can't just do that. I'm 30 years old. I can't just move to LA and be in a band. Like, I need to do something else. So, ended up working at the restaurant too. So I was doing both at the same time. But like I said, this is also. I never told anyone at the restaurant that I was in like a functioning band that would go on tour and would go record. I would always like make up excuses like, oh, I have to go visit my family for a couple days. And then Wrangler Roots actually flew to Chicago and recorded with Albini, which was like one of my dreams because I'd always wanted my drums recorded by him just to see what they would sound like,
Oh, didn't you tell me that Todd is your favorite drummer? Todd Trainer?
Oh, absolutely. Like, without any question, Todd Trainer is my favorite drummer ever of all time. Like,
and he's also the most handsome drummer in the world too, right?
Absolutely. Like Shellac will play here, I don't know, once every few years. They always play at the Bell House, which is kind of a trek to get to from the East Village. But I will drop everything to go see Shellac. If they play 3 nights in a row, I'll go all 3 nights. If they play one night, I'll go that one night. And the Bell House sounds really good, and Shellac still sounds so awesome.
I think they're better than ever, actually.
It's insane. And like Todd it's like I always stand right on the right side of the stage and I just watch him the whole time, and I have no idea how he's doing what he's doing. Like, how can he hit the drums that hard? How can he like create these rhythms that seem like there's nothing going on, but it's totally screwy. I don't get it.
I think that his drumming is a window into himself. It's like a very clear window into a very unique person.
For sure. And he actually has been to Superiority Burger a couple of times. So when Shellac does come to town, like Todd will come specifically to the restaurant, which makes me just giddy with excitement every time, so. Have
you ever cooked with Steve?
Yes, I did once. I did a weird, very strange cooking thing with Steve in Las Vegas.
Was it for the poker championship or
It
something?
was related to that, and we did kind of like a weird dinner thing that was in a crazy apartment, and it was pretty fun. That was a few years ago, so.
So it seems like drumming is something that's kind of a part of you in a way that being vegetarian is not, but it's also something that you're you go through periods of activity and then shift your attention to something else creative for a while and then come back around to drumming.
Yeah.
So I wonder, do you feel like you grow as an artist by going away and shifting your gaze to something else and then coming back to it?
I don't recommend it. I don't necessarily think it's the best or right way to do it. It's just how it's like happened for me personally.
So what was the impetus to start Superiority Burger, and what's the mission statement?
The purpose was because I'd worked in fancy restaurants for so long. And I guess I have a complicated relationship with fancy restaurants because they're kind of part of my identity. At the same time, they always bummed me out because my friends could never eat at these places unless I snuck them into the bar and gave them food for free, and like somehow didn't tell the general manager that I was doing that.
It's like if you were a symphonic musician playing great music, but your friends can't afford to spend $200 to come see you play.
Yeah, it had always kind of been a bummer, and like it was funny because when I first started doing it, it was really a bummer because I was like, I am cooking food for the 1%. I'm cooking food for the richest and most elite people of Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles or New York City.
Did you ever spit in it?
No. That only happens in an Eminem video. That never,
I've never seen somebody do that. I've worked in lots of restaurants.
The gnarliest, crazy maniac cook
cares about the food.
Would never even joke about that.
Yeah.
So, but and then I guess I kind of got used to it, like cooking for very wealthy people. And then near the end of the time I was doing it in New York, it started to really, really bother me again. So
why?
Because it just seemed like this is sort of like, wow, this is what you're doing with your life, Because it had gotten to the point where I had worked at this big fancy restaurant for a long time, to the point where like there were regulars that were billionaires that would come in and they would like request my presence at the table, and I would explain the new desserts to them, and it would just be kind of soul crushing because like what am I doing? Like I don't care about these people. Like they don't care about me. This is all some weird act. Like
it's like being a jester.
Yeah, it felt very clown-like, So, and then I guess I had like maxed out my giving away as much free food as possible to my friends showing up at the bar, and then and I had started working on this veggie burger patty, and then kind of like one thing led to the next, and found 3 or 4 people that were willing to like put in a little bit of money, and we got the storefront on East 9th Street, and kind of from that point forward the mission has always been to use all of the stuff that I learned at the fancy restaurants, the techniques, the sourcing of good quality ingredients, be it something fresh from a farmer at a local market, or like an olive oil that has the right balance of acidity and like tannins, and then incorporate that into vegetarian and mostly vegan salads and sandwiches in our tiny little space. At the same time, sell it for as cheaply as possible, almost to the detriment of the business. That's hugely important to me. Like, a lot of people will say that Superiority Burger is like, its mission is convincing people to be vegan and vegetarian, and that's not necessarily true. That's just what I know how to cook, because I never learned to cook meat in the restaurants where I worked because I was making dessert. So I don't know how to cook.
So you never worked on the line doing that?
Never.
Okay.
I don't know how to cook a steak. I don't know how to cook a hamburger the right way. I don't know how to cook a piece of fish. I just don't know. I've never done that professionally.
The Trap Set will always be available for free, but we rely on donations from our listeners. Please visit our website at thetrapset.net and click donate. Subscribe to our show on iTunes, and if you enjoy what you hear, give us a review.
Making the food as cheap as possible is really the most important thing for me, because I want people to be able to come in to the restaurant. Like, we sell the burger for $6, and it's, you know, it's a bunch of components. Everything except for the bun, which we don't have space to make, is made by hand. And then we have a broccoli salad. Once again, it's really a composed salad, and we sell it for $4. So for $10.89, including tax, you can get this sandwich and this salad, which is fully a filling meal.
Right.
In Manhattan in 2019.
Right.
Like, basically $10 to get. We're not talking about. I mean,
and it's cheaper than Chipotle even.
Yeah,
the same price.
And then because it's New York and there's lots of cheap food, like, we're not talking about a slice of pizza, which is
right.
Especially a $3 slice of pizza at like a regular pizza place, which I love.
Yeah,
stuff like that for sure. Like, don't get me wrong, but this is a different animal. Like, these are multiple different kinds of vegetables, like, handled with care and sold for inexpensive. So you can't really compare it to, well, that's $10 and a slice of pizza is $3. Like, you're definitely going to feel different if you eat the two things, you know.
How did you learn the business of running a restaurant? Like, how did you know how to put together a business plan and make sure that you weren't going to go out of business?
I have some really good partners that are much better at that than I am. So I am pretty good at making sure that we always have delicious food that tastes good. In terms of, like, keeping the place operating from, like, a financial standpoint and whatnot, that's the part that is definitely not my forte. But I've got some good partners that, like, kind of keep me in line when I get a little too far out of line in terms of, like, well, I want to charge $6 for this, and they're like, well, this is what the ingredients cost, so if you charge $6 for that, we actually lose $3. You know, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, we have a ton of regulars that come into the restaurant all the time. Really, really awesome people. A lot of which aren't vegetarian. A lot of which are hardcore vegans. And we have people that will come in, like, couples that will get a blowout and spend $50, which is a lot of food there. Mm-hmm. But we also have people that'll come in for lunch and just get one thing, right? And then they leave. But they also come 4 times a week, you know. So I love that.
And Superiority Burger has become somewhat of like an international destination at this point. Like, people come from out of town. You have cookbooks. Are you happy with the way things have panned out so far?
I am, yeah. I love it. Like, a lot of people, because it's this kind of intricate cooking done in what looks like a fast food restaurant, with kind of the trappings of a fast food restaurant too, even though it's not at all. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like fake fast food. Mm-hmm. A lot of people say, well, like, when are you going to expand? When are you going to open up one in LA? You should open up one in Nashville. Like, when are you going to do this? You should have 5 in Manhattan or whatever. And, you know, of course, you know, it'd be amazing if there were a bunch all over the country or in Tokyo or London or whatever. But at the same time, you know, the punk rock kid in me is like, what do you mean? I've got this cool, awesome restaurant that takes care of itself and employs people in the East Village of Manhattan. Like, that's enough, you know?
Yeah.
That's an amazing place to be, you know? Like, it doesn't have to be a chain, you know?
And do you feel that way, like, most of the time? Is there also, like, an ambitious business person in your head?
Oh,
that does battle with the punk rocker?
Oh,
or coexist?
It's. I mean, the business person gets beaten down pretty much every time. But at the same time, you know, we went to Tokyo and did a 2-day pop-up out there in October. And we're at the airport coming back, and all I could think of was, like, how could we open up one of these in Tokyo? That would be just the most incredible thing. So yeah, it's there for sure.
Has anybody approached you about selling your patties at Whole Foods or something like that?
We have had people ask about that. a little bit a little bit of a control freak. So something like that, mass production of a thing, you have to kind of give away to, it's usually called a co-packing situation, where your recipe gets
modified,
developed and modified for ease and efficiency,
shelf life,
maybe somewhere in like Ohio or something like that, and then frozen. So I don't, that's not really like, that sort of gives me the willies thinking about it. So
are you the kind of person that plans?
Yeah, I'm a crazy list maker. Like,
what's on your list right now?
My list right now is we're doing a big crazy event in Los Angeles in a couple weeks. So I have to sit down with Dave, my one of my kitchen managers, to basically create this insane list of things we need to get and acquire to do this like 4-hour event in LA, which is a really big, it's like a vegan festival, which is not something that we would normally do, but I kind of just want to go to LA.
Yeah.
And hopefully the financials work out and we don't totally lose money, and we also make at least a little bit of money to pay for plane tickets and stuff like that. So it's cool. I like stuff like this because there's definitely a similarity with like touring, because you have to get your equipment in line and the things you potentially have to rent in a weird place, and then find a place to do the cooking, which, you know, I can either rent a commercial kitchen that's probably a total mess, or I can really, really nicely ask a friend who runs a restaurant, potentially a fancy restaurant, if I can squeeze into a corner of their nice kitchen for a few hours, a couple days, you know. So there's a lot of like connections, and like, you know, and then that person, then when they come to New York, make sure that they're showered with snacks and stuff like that, you know. So the planning and the list making, it will be intense today for sure.
Is there anything on like your longer term list?
Well, to always make the restaurant seem as exciting as possible, because it's this tiny little place. There's only 6 places to sit, so it's mostly takeout, but it's not really takeout food. It's like food that you need to sit down. But I like the weirdness of that too, especially in the summer when it's nice out. People will just be spread out all over down the block, any flat surface, sitting and basically eating salad and drinking iced tea, and nobody's drunk, and nobody's like, if you're on drugs, then you didn't.
Right.
I didn't help you along with that. You know?
Yeah.
It's just this weird, fun social experiment where like it's a big crowd of people eating salad, you know, outside. You know, it's fun.
Did your mom get to eat at Superiority Burger?
No, she never. She did. She passed away before it opened. She would have totally been super, super psyched on it.
It seems like her philosophy is part of the guiding principles of the restaurant.
Oh yeah, for sure. In fact, even when I make a big salad in a bowl today, like I'll always think about her, because she would make these, no matter what bowl she used to mix a salad, there was always too much in it. So it was all, leaves would be falling all over the ground. And I spend a good chunk of my day with a broom and a dustpan, like sweeping up like little bits of leaves and radishes from the floor, you know. So,
well, Brooks Headley, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks. It was fun, man.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.